We know what's going to happen as climate change gets worse. People reluctantly are going to have to leave their homes and they're going to go elsewhere. They're going to migrate.
Experts believe millions of people will be displaced by climate change over the next half-century.
The flooding continues even now during dry season. By mid-century, climate change will have forced 40 million people to flee their homes in Indonesia alone.
The number of people who are displaced and who will be displaced in the future depend a lot on our policies, on climate policies.
The German climate leadership brand, environmental brand, is suffering. You're about to miss the 2020 target. It's very damaging.
Life will not be the same as here. There's a lot of illnesses, there will be plagues, and the economic growth of the whole world will be disturbed by horizontal strife.
The scientists have said that in 50 years, Philippines will submerge underwater.
It's hereditary to leave where you come from.
We never wish to be refugees. And I think as a leader, it's important that we provide options. We know it's coming, so we should be acting accordingly, beginning from now.
Welcome back to Beyond the Wall. We just shared with you the great live art by graphic recorder Lita Curry, which each of one of you will receive after this event. Now let us continue with Model 3. Dear friends, ladies and gentlemen, we live in a paradox. We live in a world with barriers and borders and division, and yet when you zoom out, when you look at Earth from space, you see one. This is why it's so important to explore the social dilemma around finding sustainable solutions to unsustainable reality. Migration and sustainability concurrently affect the ecological footprint of this world, but not in the way that you can imagine. Experts are saying that by 2050, 10% of the world population will be displaced from their place of birth. That could be anything between 140 and 1 billion people. Small island nations are said to be the first one to take the hit, and yet they are the smallest contribution to greenhouse emissions. We will explore the narrative surrounding small island nations as a front frontier on climate change with the Honorable Prime Minister Natano from Tuvalu. We will discuss further the crucial role of governance in addressing climate change with the Honorable Gaston Brown from Antigua and Barbuda. Due to the time difference, those two islands are separated by oceans and 12 time zones, but united by fate. So we have united them in a pre-recorded message for you. Please enjoy it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honor and pleasure to introduce you to the Honorable Prime Minister Natano of Tuvalu. Dear Prime Minister, we all remember the images of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres, who was, I think, 2 years ago, visiting your island. And we all still hear his scream to the world to stop Tuvalu and the world from sinking. We really want to know how this reflects in your everyday lives and what that means when you wake up for the reality of every citizen of Tuvalu.
Yes, thank you very much. And I'm also honored to have this opportunity to relay this message to the world, for the world to know and to hear our concerns here in Tuvalu. As you are aware, climate change has brought about adverse effects that have impacted on the people of Tuvalu. The impacts of on our water supplies, coastal areas, settlements, agriculture, and fisheries, to name a few. We have seen it all. And my people have lived with these changes. Livelihoods have changed as people adapt to the new norm. And severe cyclones and prolonged droughts have displaced vulnerable population from their ancestral land to find better land to build their livelihoods. Temporary movements of people has disturbed sustainable development of individual families. As the Secretary General have very strongly called the world to help small island countries, especially the low-lying atolls. The government is also committed to building resilience of communities, policies and plans that are being formulated to clearly lay the platform that guides interventions and efforts to support the people of Tuvalu, strengthen resilience through adaptations. Extensive efforts have been put into adaptation measures in sectors that are most vulnerable and have greater dependency of livelihoods. The cost of adaptation has been realized, hence the government is building the capacity of personnel to enable maximize accessibility to climate change finance for resilience building. Tuvalu is also continuing its efforts to advocate at the international level for the greater recognition of its vulnerability and strengthen the partnership with the global community to pay more attention and invest in reducing greenhouse gas emission and building resilience. Now you mentioned, you asked a question on what we feel about what's going to happen in the next 5 to 10 years. There's certainly scientific reports of the best available are keeping informed, yet the world tends to ignore this for the convenience. The 6th Amendment report of the IPCC is coming out soon, and that will bring another update of the science of climate change. I would plead to the major emitters to take responsibility and encourage those with the capabilities to assist vulnerable countries to adapt to impacts of climate change. It is my hope that with the advancement of technology we have today and the level of understanding our practitioners have, I am confident that collective efforts can restore our planet, break down walls, and be able to work with each other to address climate change. In the, I think mid-20s, we experienced tropical TC-PAM, tropical cyclone PAM. We have a scheme, the New Zealand have a scheme called the Pacific Access Category, where people from the Pacific can apply for employment and citizenship in New Zealand. Over the years, people here in Tuvalu continue to apply to this scheme. But what I experienced after the tropical cyclone PAM, the number of applications just shoot up almost 200%. This is a very clear message, to the government that there is a threat, that people are continuing to be threatened by the climate change, and especially the sea level rise. TC-PAM, the cyclone was not that devastating, but the waves, the waves that comes along with the TC-PAM. TC-PAM was passed Tuvalu and hit Vanuatu, which is quite far from Tuvalu. But the waves that brings along by the cyclone, those are the most damaging impacts to the lives of the people. The waves just went through the islands and destroying all the food crops, and also the houses of the people. So I think those are some of the evidence that we could provide to the people, to the world. That climate change continues to be the major threat to the lives of the people of Tuvalu.
Thank you, Prime Minister. You mentioned as well cyclone. We have on this webinar as well Prime Minister Brown from Antigua and Barbuda. And same time as Secretary General was visiting you, the hurricanes, as you know, in 2017 and 18 were devastating the Caribbean islands. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, where I worked a lot with the Prime Minister, I had visited the islands where 95% of the population of Barbuda had to be relocated to the sister island of Antigua. And until today, those people, most of them have not still been able to return. Their homes have not been yet rebuilt. In your case, you don't have a sister island. As you mentioned, you have schemes for immigration to New Zealand. But what is the real reality, and whether I have heard from your administration that leaving the island is not an option? What are options you have if the rest of the world does not wake up and make a change to their everyday habits in order to stop this? And it will take time to stop. But what are really the options for your citizens if the climate change continues in the same way for the next 25 years? What measures are you planning to take?
Yes, thank you. Thank you also for that question. We have given the citizen of Tuvalu options, where they can, the government is prepared. The government is prepared to facilitate any citizen who wishes to migrate to any country, whether New Zealand, Australia, or other neighboring countries in the region. And we also have plans to reclaim, to build artificial island here in the capital, with the hope to raise the level of the land to around 5 to 10 meters above sea level. The idea was to reclaim part of the lagoon here in the capital, which will bring the land area to around almost 20 square kilometers. That is an option that we are also looking at. We have the materials in the lagoon that could fill up that part of the lagoon for the people to move to, in case there is a threat from the sea level rise, and especially the cyclone as well. But we also have joined these small bodies, the AOCs and the least developed countries. We are also member of the forum, the Blue Pacific. We could also request these friends of ours and see if they could help us to the fight against the emitters of greenhouse gases. But those are some of the plans that we have, and I think it all depends on the on the government, what the government is ready to do during that time. I think it all depends on the confidence of the people relies on the governments, and but certainly the option of migration is also a last resort.
Hopefully you'll never have to live it, and will not reach to that. As you know, many countries in the world, such as the United Arab Emirates, have reclaimed a lot from the sea, and the technology is evolving every day around the world. Some of the YPO leaders that will be listening to this conversation are leading some of these international companies and hopefully some of them will be able to reach out and help with technology or know-how or assistance from other countries to find other solutions than really leaving your beautiful island. So again, Prime Minister, thank you very much for your time. We hope to pass this message to as many decision takers as possible and to sensibilize them on the responsibility we all have. Thank you for your time again.
Thank you also for the opportunity.
I have the immense pleasure to introduce you, ladies and gentlemen, the Honorable Prime Minister Castin Brown of Antigua and Barbuda. I have the pleasure of working with him for the last 7 years and witnessed in 2017, like the rest of us, the devastating images of Hurricane Irma and Maria, who destroyed the sister island of Barbuda. Prime Minister Brown, tell us, when this happened and the sustainability and the livelihood of your countries was questioned, what have you done for the last 3 years? What changes have you implemented so this doesn't happen again, or that your country is more prepared? And what steps also have you taken in terms of obstacles of international cooperation? We do remember the pledges that many countries did when the hurricane hit the island. 3 years later, what is the reality?
Well, you know, climate change is real. And here in the Caribbean, we would have suffered the consequences of climate change disproportionately. So we are committed in playing our part in reducing our own emissions, and at the same time to encourage the international community to reduce their emissions as well, so that we can reduce global temperatures below 1.5 degrees of pre-industrial levels. And the whole idea here is to protect the planet and to protect humanity. In the case of Antigua and Barbuda, we have a very ambitious intended national contribution in which we intend to reduce our use of fossil fuel energy and to transition into green energy to the extent by about 2030. Green energy applications will account for about 50% of our total energy consumption or production. And I would say by about 2040, we hope to fully transition into green energy applications and to leave oil in the ground where it belongs. Now, in terms of specific measures that we have taken to address the issues of climate change, they are manifold. And as we all know, climate change is widespread. I mean, involves extreme heat resulting in fires. We have seen what would have happened in Brazil over the last decade, in which we have had those forest fires destroying thousands of acres of flora and even fauna. And we have seen that in the United States as well, even destroying human settlements, destroying homes, and destroying people's livelihoods. So we have taken the necessary steps to mitigate against the effects of climate change. And we would have seen too some level of bushfires here, but we would have also suffered from ocean acidification, which would have resulted in the bleaching of our coral reefs, and perhaps the most devastating of all of the effects to include droughts. We have had consistent droughts here, and the occasional flood. So the most devastating would have been the frequent and ferocious hurricanes that we have witnessed during the last, I'd say, couple of decades. So we have been mitigating against the effects of climate change in various ways. For example, within the last 5 years of my administration, we have spent about $60 million to acquire solar and wind energy applications in order to reduce the reliance on fossil fuel energy. We would have invested over $20 million to develop the reverse osmosis water system, to the extent that our water supply, we now depend on reverse osmosis to the extent of about 90% of the overall water supply. So that too, is an area in which we would have mitigated against the effects of the droughts, which obviously over the years would have reduced the amount of fresh water that's available to the population. Going back about probably 15 years ago, we'd have taken the steps to eliminate all of the ozone depleting substances. And, Antigua and Barbuda has been literally at the forefront of fighting climate change, going back to the Earth Conference in 1992 in Brazil and subsequently the signing of the Kyoto Protocol. We believe that based on the fact that we are among the worst affected by climate change, that we have to provide global leadership on this issue. So we remain very hopeful that just like the Berlin Wall, in East and West Germany, and that wall was torn down, we have no doubt that similarly, that the climate change wall will be torn down in order to ensure the sustainability and survivability of human beings globally.
And Prime Minister Brown, how do you see in the current international political situation, post the US elections with the new administration in place, when it comes to the notion of environmental refugees, what change can we expect from the world in the next 10 years?
Well, it's an area in which we would like countries globally to pay more attention and to be a little more empathetic to the needs of displaced persons, individuals who have been displaced as a result of climate change. Climate refugee is not quite a legal concept as yet, but Antigua and Barbuda has been advocating for the concept of climate refugees to be made a legal concept recognizable in law, and for countries to accept individuals who have been displaced by climate change. Here in the Caribbean, we would have seen over the years, especially back in 2017 when we had those ferocious and frequent storms, including Irma and Maria, we'd have seen a number of people, a number of our residents and citizens were actually displaced. Even in our sister island, Barbuda, we had the whole issue there of internally displaced persons, in which 1,800 Barbudans had to be evacuated from Barbuda at the time. I mean, the island was deemed to be uninhabitable as a result of the impact, or the carnage for that matter, that was created by Hurricane Irma. And we had to move them to Antigua. They were literally internally displaced persons. We had to provide for them. It cost the central government tens of millions of dollars to provide for them. And even up to today, we have not fully recovered Barbuda, in that the $600 million bill that was required to fully restore Barbuda proved to have been a very daunting task, and we are incrementally addressing the issue. And admittedly, we have made significant progress, but because of the magnitude of the damage associated with Hurricane Irma, the full recovery has been protracted. But again, our government is fully committed to ensure that there is a full recovery in due course. In Dominica, for example, we had thousands of Dominicans who came to Antigua after Dominica was decimated by Hurricane Maria. So you had there a situation in which there were individuals who I considered to have been climate migrants who migrated from Dominica to Antigua in order to escape, the carnage that was created by Hurricane Maria. So again, I don't think we are doing enough globally, and that perhaps this is one of the issues that the G20 leaders need to take into consideration, and to use their significant global influence to get more developed countries and even the large developing countries to legally accept the concept of climate refugees, so that we can be more responsive to individuals who become displaced as a result of climate change.
Thank you, Prime Minister Brown, and I hope all of our fellow members of YPO and Global Citizen Forum have enjoyed your insightful thought leadership on how a nation like yours, who is suffering from the consequences of the way of living of the rest of the world, is taking initiative and proactively taking measures to make this world a better place and to reduce their footprint on climate change. Thank you for your time, and let's continue with the rest of our exciting panelists.
It is my pleasure now to introduce you to Jean-Philippe Chozi, the Chief of Mission of the International Organization for Migration, mostly known as IOM. Let's him lead the conversation on climate migration. Jean-Philippe shares years of experience in the field of migration, previously serving as Global Director of Communications for the World Food Programme, as well as spending years as BBC World Service journalist. Within this global field, Jean-Philippe has uncovered important political changes capable of influencing the world at large, notably when it comes to climate change. Today, as we face the reality of climate change, we're also noticing environmental degradation and natural disaster as the main drivers for refugee movement. Hello, Jean-Philippe.
Yes, good afternoon to all.
Great.
Thank you, Mr. Upton. Maybe I should start by saying that the contribution of His Excellency Castin and the Honorable Castin Brown really resonates very strongly with me personally, because it really brings me back to 2009, December 2009, when I actually accompanied the then Director General of IOM, the UN Migration Agency, to Copenhagen for the climate conference. And at the time, IOM was very much, and remains today very much, on the front line of advocating on behalf of least developed countries, of small island developing states, and of countries that are affected by climate change and environmental degradation, by basically saying we need more solidarity globally, because those countries that are contributing very little to carbon emissions are on the front line and are suffering from the direct consequences of climate change and environmental degradation. And this message and this advocacy drive has continued. But Amor, you forgot to mention maybe in your initial presentation that I've actually just come out of serving for 2 years in a country which is affected already by climate change, South Sudan, with recurrent flooding and massive internal displacement that is linked to the impact of this climate change on the flooding that are becoming much more extended in time and much more important in their magnitude. And I note also that the Honorable Castin Brown mentioned the impact that addressing the root causes of climate change and addressing the consequences of climate change in terms of internal displacement is. And you're literally looking at hundreds of millions of dollars that are spent yearly to address the consequences of climate change. For South Sudan, for instance, the humanitarian response plan for a country which is affected by acute malnutrition and insecurity is already in the vicinity of $1.5 billion per year for the UN to respond to those challenges. And on top of that, every year, recurrently, we have another 100 million that are to be dispersed and found to address the needs of those populations displaced by those recurrent floodings. So what can be done? I think it is important basically to look at the issue in a holistic manner. There's a lot that can be done in terms of prevention and adaptation, and I think both prime ministers underline this. How can you mitigate the risk of climate change? How can you adapt? And migration is, and has always been from time immemorial, a way to adapt to changing environments. But that being said, what we're seeing at the moment, obviously the international media focus on extreme climatic events, cyclones, major floodings, less so on slow onset phenomena such as deforestation, environmental degradation, land degradation. And this is having an impact on migratory patterns. Now, just to clarify the terminology, climate refugee, climate migrant, I think it was said quite clearly by the Honorable Castin Brown that although it might be astute to continue advocating for some form of protection for people affected by climate change and environmental degradation. For the moment, this definition doesn't really have any kind of legally binding aspect. And the other point I'd like to make is that when you look at migration patterns that are linked to environmental degradation and climate change, those are mostly internal displacement. In other words, people that will leave areas that are affected by these phenomenon, usually moving towards urban areas. And that's the case in South Sudan, it's the case in the DR Congo, where I also served over the past 5 years. And these are putting real pressure on very fragile infrastructures that are not ready to cope with those important internal migration flows. Bearing in mind that those affected are usually the poorest and the most vulnerable, you do have some regional migration patterns, but these usually will stay within the region. There's little evidence for the moment of intercontinental migration flows that are linked to environmental degradation and climate change. So addressing, if you want, the root causes, whether it is through prevention, mitigation, through preparedness, and there was a reference to preparedness in terms of developing, those islands, artificial islands. That's one track, obviously, that needs to be followed. But fundamentally, if you look, for instance, at the funding that is available, for instance, through the Green Climate Fund, which is really dedicated to least developing countries, to small island developing states, to help them basically to adapt to climate change, to reduce their greenhouse emissions. Those funds, and I think there is a target of 100 billion from developed nations to help those countries adapt. This funding is clearly not at the level it should be. So there needs to be a global investment to help those countries that are most affected by climate change, by environmental degradation, to basically prepare and adapt. I also note the difficulties in organizing what I would call a comprehensive plan of action to prepare ourselves for what could be wider migration flows. And again, the numbers, we should be very careful with numbers. I heard 1 billion people affected. Well, migration still today is an issue that polarizes. And therefore, there will be some migration patterns linked to climate change and environmental degradation. Now, whether there will be of the magnitude that has been projected, this remains to be seen. And I would say that the work at the moment is very much on how can we prepare, how can we prevent, how can we mitigate, how can we work with communities to make sure that they take very practical steps to address those challenges, and how can we make sure that nations such as Antigua and Barbuda, Tuvalu, can basically achieve their socio-economic well-being. And that is the challenge when you're looking at the cost of responding to these extreme climatic events. So at this moment in time, I think it is pretty critical to raise awareness globally. And there was a reference to the new US administration rejoining the Paris Climate Agreement. It is really an issue that we all have to face and will have to face for the next generations. Migration is one component that IOM, the UN Migration Agency, is specifically looking at through very kind of concrete steps. I mean, let me just give you a very kind of grassroots example of what can be done in countries like South Sudan, where I've just served, in terms of reducing green gas emissions. Partnerships with the private sector, and I know, and I do hope there's some private sector directors on the call. Solarization is particularly important. Biogas also. If you're looking at internal displacement in countries like South Sudan affecting up to 2 million people that are living in difficult conditions in IDP camps. Being able to provide energy through solarization, through partnerships with the private sector, really makes a big difference. Making sure that you can provide energy through biogas, that's another avenue that we need to look at. We also need to make sure that we can build the capacity of our membership to address those challenges. And again, I would really strongly encourage certainly more and stronger and sustained partnerships with the private sector to make sure that we, UN agencies, have the technological savoir-faire, the knowledge to continue and to adapt those technologies to the countries in which we are working, and to also help those countries anticipate the impact of climate change and environmental migration. So maybe one other important, I think, element to mention is very much linked to the financial impact that climate change and environmental migration has on countries. And this is obviously made quite worse by the current COVID pandemic. And we know that this is having an impact not just on the economies of those countries, but also on the flow of remittances. In other words, money that they send back by migrants from the diaspora to the home countries. So unfortunately, what we have here is probably an accumulation of factors. It's not just climate change, low onset changes, extreme climatic events. It's also now a global pandemic. And we probably have, unfortunately, some of the elements for a perfect storm. So it is really now a rallying cry that I think we all need to have to make sure that we get the decision makers, we get the private sector. The UN is a strong partner in many countries, civil society actors, to make sure that we can all come up with a common set of actions, looking at addressing the immediate consequences of climate change, but also looking to the future and how we're going to address and mitigate those population movements, those migratory movements that will probably require countries like New Zealand, for instance, to accept as a need for protection people from the Tuvalus, for instance. And let me just conclude by this, because it's always something that doesn't really come across in all the aspects, discussions around climate change and migration. Climate change really affects many human rights. The right to food. When you have desertification, when you have flooding, people go hungry. In South Sudan, 6.5 million people are on the verge of starvation because of flooding and because of irregular crops. It affects the right to health. It affects the right to education. It affects the right to work. So if we are to stand by those fundamental human rights, we need to address climate change and environmental degradation, because this is the condition sine qua non for those human rights, fundamental human rights, to be respected. Thank you.
Merci, Jean-Philippe. Thank you for your incredible input. I apologize for forgetting your experience in South Sudan, which I'm sure is very valuable in your everyday work. I assure you that your call to action has been heard from hundreds of presidents and CEOs as part of this YPO community, and I hope that they'll take it further and create these partnerships where the know-how can be transferred to much needed states in challenging times like this one. And I will personally take you up as well on working on definition and accepting legally the term of climate refugee with the Global Citizen Forum. So without further delay, thank you again. And it is now a great honor to introduce you our next speaker, a regarded artist, a musician, actor, 3 times Grammy Award winner, a father, a great human being, and an amazing storyteller of hope. Throughout his life journey, he has shown the world the power of breaking barriers and reaching out beyond borders. Please join me in welcoming the living legend, the dear friend, the brother from another mother, Wyclef Jean.
How's everybody doing? I assume everybody could see me. Yo, you just said a brother from another mother. Don't let me find out you a rapper, because I'll put you on the track with the Fugees. So it's an honor for me to be here. Good morning, good afternoon, good night. I'm actually just waking up, and this is how a rapper looks when he wakes up. You see, no makeup, no nothing. This the refugee right here, baby. So I was born in Haiti, actually. And my father left me, I think I was like 1 year old. So the level of poverty, I would say that coming up for me was the idea of electricity. We ain't had no electricity. The idea of like clean water, we ain't have that, right? So we had to go miles and miles for the wells, to the well for the water. If my daughter was here right now, she'd be like, Dad, please, not the donkey story again. But I always try to show her this reality and explain to her how grateful we are, because when I say the word refugees, it's not just a word, it's the understanding of having family members that their soul is still on the Cuban shore. You know, the idea of fleeing a place because of a form of dictatorship and keeping the people oppressed. And like you're getting on a boat, right? And it's not even no real boat, or you're going by foot and you're trying to get to somewhere where you can find that refuge. And like my brother just told y'all, when we look at it from the satellite point of view, it really looks like a world without borders. You know what I mean? So for me, the best way that I could probably express it is through poetry. And so I figured a lot of people is going to be speaking. So I bought a guitar and I figured like, so I have a gift. Like I can make songs up like on the spot, you know? So some of y'all might have heard this song. Y'all like, that's Carlos Santana. You're right, but I wrote that for Carlos Santana. So good morning, Wyclef Jean. We're in the vibe. What a day it was when the Berlin Wall came down. What a day it was for me as a refugee. But looking at the world from the satellite point of view, it's one world, one heart, one mind, one soul. Yeah, once again, oh, what a day it was when the Berlin Wall came down. Oh, what a sight to see. Oh, Wyclef the refugee. But looking at it from the satellite point of view, it's one mind, one world, one heart. A world with no borders, I see. Americans say, how you doing? German people say, wie geht's? When I go to Germany, they say, wie steht's? If you love hip hop, let's have some spots. Tell me, baby girl, wie wären das? Yeah. Wyclef, man, I stay in the zone. And my people in Brooklyn told me to tell y'all shalom, man. This is how I rock. I got it going on. Bismillah, Ar-Rahman, Ar-Rahim. That's for my people in Lebanon. Yeah, it's Wyclef Jean. And turn up your radio station. Better yet, we on Zoom. I bring the tune. I produce, never reduce like the Greeks in mythology and rapping. I'm Zeus. They told me to get on to bring the order. So I came to talk to you about border without border. we don't need no borders, cause the world is one. And Wyclef Jean in the place, I'm singing this song. What a sight it was to see the Berlin Wall come down. Oh, what a sight to see for Wyclef the refugee. Looking at it from the satellite point of view, yeah. It's one word, one heart, one mind, one soul. A world without borders, yeah. Good morning. All pirates, yes, they're robbers. So like to the merchant ships. Many after they took our people from the bottomless pit. But my hand was made strong by the hand of the Almighty. We struggle in this generation, triumphantly. All my global citizens, yeah, won't you help me sing another song of freedom? Cause all I ever had, redemption song, boy, redemption song. Emancipate yourself from mental slavery. Not what ourselves can free our minds. Have no fear for atomic energy, but none of them can stop at the time. How long will it kill our prophets while we stand aside and look? Some say it's just a part of it. We've got to fulfill the board. Global citizens unite, yeah. Won't you help me sing another song of freedom? Cause all I ever had, redemption song. Refugees, baby. Love y'all.
Hey, from another refugee to another, thank you. Thank you so much from all of us for this incredible input and performance, which will stay for us forever. Until the next time, when you will be invited to perform with us live on stage in Berlin. So we're going to find one wall to take brick by brick down with you. Now, without further delays, let me start with the module number 4, the final stage of this amazing journey.